there is all these narratives that if we give the mind to Western capital, then we will bring peace to these regions that are in direct contact with, are on the contact line of contact with Azerbaijan, right? So if there is like Western capital here, then it means that we are going to be protected. That's like Milena was saying, that's delusional thinking. Capital is not going to save you. Like it didn't work with the Russians. Certainly, let's give everything to Russia and then they will come and protect us. That didn't work, and it's not going to work with Western powers either. So you might as well just be more level-headed and rational about it. Like, instead of just giving out everything you own to this other, all sorts of capitalists, whether they're Russian or Swedish or I don't know, British.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Other Armenias podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Milena Abrahamian.
I'm the other one, Tamar Shirinyan.
And before we go any further, we're just going to remind you to please subscribe, like, comment, engage with us. We really love hearing from you. And yes, today we have a guest, Sona Baldrian, with whom we're going to have a conversation, an interactive conversation that we're really excited about. Tamar, you can introduce our guest.
Sona Baldrian is an independent researcher who investigates issues, a lot of things, but development, neoliberalization, gender, and I've had the pleasure of being at various conferences and forums with Sona, and it's always interesting to talk to her. So we're excited to have her here on our podcast.
So we're talking about decolonization and how it applies or is relevant for the Armenian context. And we want to start off by just asking the question of what is decolonization, to be able to be on the same terms and have the same understanding of this term. So actually, Tamar, maybe you can say a few words about this.
So I'll say a few things. So what is decolonization is a question that is really important to me. One of my favorite writers, and we've actually talked about this before in our episode with Lara and Stephen Shihai, about decolonizing and psychoanalysis, especially, and concepts that are useful in the practice of decolonization. And then I've been reading a lot of Fanon lately. I'm actually teaching a course right now called Decolonization. So what is decolonization? Decolonization is a violent process. Decolonization is not reform. It's not about changing how we think or, changing the way we see the world. It's not epistemological. It's not about knowledge. It's not cultural. It involves all of those things. But I think most importantly, decolonization is a violent process. It doesn't necessarily have to be physically violent. It's not about military or armed violence. But decolonization is about throwing the colonizer off your back, right? In a very violent way. And that happens at all of the levels. It happens economically, it happens politically, sometimes it happens militarily, it happens epistemologically, structurally, socially, culturally, nationally, all of these things. And so in order for decolonization to be a process, there has to be colonization, right? So part of the question of, what is decolonization is what is colonization. And we wanted to have this conversation because I think that recently, and it actually has been a very recent phenomenon, something that I've, noticed in the last few times that I've been to Armenia, and just seeing different things on social media, how civil society is engaging different concepts, how civil society is actually changing in Armenia, the way that it understands things, with a lot of attention to colonialism, decolonization, and all of these kinds of things recently. And I don't think that when civil society in Armenia, especially by civil society, we might say non-governmental organizations, are talking about the decolonial or decolonization, that is not what they have in mind by decolonization. And the colonization that I'm thinking about, the one that Fanon was writing about and that others were writing about, and experiencing in historical reality, is not what they have in mind. So I'll say that bit there.
Thanks for that. So I mean, if there's anything that you want to add, Sona, to that.
Yes. First of all, hello to everyone watching us today. I think the job that Tamar and Milan are doing with this podcast is like the work that they're doing is very important. And I think it's very important to document these more marginalized narratives, both about Armenia and Armenianness in the way that they do. I think the methodology is very important. And I think this is very important work. I've been a fan of the podcast since day one. So for me, as someone who studies development and hopes to, in the future, probably do a PhD in this on critical development studies, I always sort of come across this issue of decolonization, and especially since you're as someone who's studying the post-Soviet context, this issue is inescapable, right? And I often see different questions about post-socialism, post-communism, post-Sovietism, and how they are often equated to post-colonialism. And sometimes there is a lot of debate whether or not you should be equating both, whether or not the theories of decolonization are transferable to the post-Soviet geography, right? And at the beginning, I was always like very resistant to these ideas of like, we can just take from the Western academia, from Western theorists, from Fanon, even like just like name dropping Fanon now and then in our texts, and then just apply it to the Armenian context and not be expected to be challenged on that. I was always like, maybe there's something more to this. And then the more I read, the more I understood that this is a very complicated, field, and the post-Soviet studies field in general. And like I think a lot of historians, social scientists, and in the humanities, and everyone else are just like constantly debating, for example, whether or not the Soviet Union was an empire. And there is like even a debate between those who consider it to be an empire, but consider it to be a more the affirmative action empire, as opposed to the evil empire that Ronald Reagan has, labeled it as such, right? So when I was, I recently read a very important text about post-socialism and by this very interesting Italian Marxist. His name is Enzo Traverso. And he was talking about how, like, the revolutions, the Velvet revolutions that have happened in Eastern Europe since 1989 have created societies that are obsessed reimagining a past that socialism and the socialist revolutions have supposedly taken away from them. And that resonated with me really deeply, especially after full scale of invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022, I think we have seen how both sides of this conflict, and by both sides I mean Russia and the West, always push their own geopolitical narratives and push narratives that serve their military campaigns and the purposes of their military campaigns. And I sort of, whenever you criticize this, or whenever you try to be more critical of these discourses, I've been to many conferences in Europe last year where whenever I tried to do an intervention into these discourses, I was blamed. I was labeled as a Putinist, or someone who sides with, with the invaders and considers occupation to be okay. And I just I think there needs to be more critical discourse on this. And I think Ukrainians especially are doing a very good job at this. Critical Ukrainian scholars are doing a very good job at this. And it's important also to listen to them, because I do believe that these discourses in Armenia are very inorganic and astroturfed often, and they come from Ukraine and they come from Georgia as well, but I think mostly Ukraine. And I think it's important to criticize this equation of decolonization equals ethno-nationalism plus neoliberalism. I've questioned, post-Soviet scholars who study decolonization for their inadequate criticisms of capitalism and how capitalism has transformed life in the post-Soviet space. And their answer to me was just, well, I don't think capitalism is bad. I think socialism was bad. And I think capitalism, the free market, has finally given us the ability to own businesses, to do freely to move and do this and that. And that, sort of primitive surface level answers never satisfy me. So I think we need to have a more deeper discussions about decolonization in this specific geography. That doesn't necessarily mean going back to Europe, right? And going back to some sort of modernity that we lost as a result of the socialist revolutions or as a result of the communization of our countries. I think Armenia in that sense is a little bit more lucky than other countries in the post-Soviet space, because decommunization in Armenia has not been as strong as in other parts of the post-Soviet space. I think mostly as a result of the local oligarchs or the political capitalists in Armenia being closely aligned with their Russian counterparts and not wanting to appear as anti-Russian. So they haven't adopted these decommunization narratives as strongly as in other parts of post-Soviet space. And I think we need to be more conscious of this research agendas that come into our country from other places, which are in and of themselves colonial and do produce colonial research and agendas. And I think some sort of autonomy in the knowledge production economy that we have today is needed in order to create knowledge that actually serves decolonial purposes and actual decolonial purposes, and serves the struggle against colonialism.
Can I just ask a question? I wonder how both of you think about how did it even come to be that decolonization in this context now has anything to do with this idea of a return to Europe? Where did this even, how did it even get to that? From the definition that Tamar, you were just giving us, how did it even, how is that even, how are they even connected? How does decolonization start to mean a return to Europe for anyone? That's very strange to me, because isn't the whole point of to get Europe off your back? If that's what if that's what it was about initially. How do you see this story of how it became intertwined. Decolonization equals a return to Europe for some of these contexts, like post-socialist, post-Soviet contexts.
I don't know if you want to start, Sona, but
no, you can go.
I mean, I think, you know, I'll give a kind of the story that I'm familiar with in terms of the history of this. So when we say, right, like when the three of us and maybe some of our audience are thinking about colonization and imperialism and colonialism and all these, especially in the modern era, we're talking about Western Europe, right? And then maybe the US in some way, especially in, you know, as kind of like post-colonial empire or something, empire of capital. But I think that what happens in the post-Soviet and not just post-Soviet, but also post-socialist world is that you get this other version of colonialism, that colonialism is any form of like some power, right? It's power. It's colonialism basically amounts to any form of like power, domination, hegemony, even, right? And so the Soviet Union becomes in this, and I think this is actually in Armenia, this is very recent. In Armenia, this happened, I would like definitely post Velvet so-called revolution, but it maybe even later than that. The first time that I ever encountered the narrative of Armenia as having a history of colonialism by Russia or by the Soviet Union was maybe in like 2022. And and it was like shocking to me, because before that, the understanding that I'd always got kind of become familiar with, that I'd seen, is either something very nuanced in the sense of even with like with very liberal, very Western oriented, like academics or the professional class, NGO workers and others, even the very liberal ones had a more nuanced understanding of it, that yes, you know, Russia had some kind of cultural, maybe linguistic hegemony in this part of the world, but it wasn't really colonial, because Russia also in many ways allowed Armenia to thrive. Armenia as a nation had a kind of cultural renaissance during the Soviet era. If it wasn't for, you know, the Bolsheviks, Armenia might not have even survived as a republic or as a nation, even maybe at this point in history. So these were the kinds of stories that I would get about the relationship between from liberals about, you know, Russia and the relationship to the United States. Now, when you talk to people, it's a very clear cut. Russia is and always has been a colonial power. That includes now, which is understandable, because I'll Russia is very much one of the colonial players, one of the imperialist powers in Armenia now. But it's also, that applies to the Soviet era, and that implies also, of course, to the Tsarist era, which of course I'll also concede, right? Yes, that was actually an empire, not necessarily the modern colonial empire that we think of now, but more akin to it perhaps than, you know, what we understand the Soviet Union. So in this way, what especially Eastern Europeans have, you know, thought about this as, Europe was one continent of civilized peoples, always civilized peoples, and then comes Soviet invasion and ruins the relationship that one part of Europe has to the rest of Europe, and cuts off that relationship. So you have the rest of Western Europe normally developed and progressed, created capitalism in the ways that it should have, gets liberal democracy, and has all of those, you know, nice accoutrement of, you know, good progress and civilization. And then Eastern Europe is under horrible tyranny and dictatorship, authoritarian, totalitarianism is, I think, the totalitarianism, and all of these horrible things. And also communism, which is a perverse modern trajectory, which moves Eastern Europe away from modernity towards some backward, other kind of, pre-feudal even, form of life. And it ruins the real whiteness of Eastern Europe. So now Eastern Europe is no longer under that totalitarianism, is no longer under the horrors of communism, as many of them like to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're free, but they're left backward. And so now they're the less civilized, less white brothers of what should have been their equal European brothers all along, right? And that narrative, which, seems okay. I mean, it's not okay at all. It's completely racist and horrible. But it seems to make some sense in Europe, right? In Eastern Europe. But to apply that to, like, Georgia or Armenia, where all of a sudden, like, Georgians and Armenians are supposed to be like, could have been part of this wonderful European civilization, but these backward, peoples and communism and all of that ruined it for them, right? That part doesn't seem to make sense at all. And then it becomes very clear that this is very much a borrowed narrative in the region.
Mm-hmm.
And is not coming out of the thinking of people here, but is being brought here from other places.
Mm-hmm. I think to the question about like how did it become about returning to Europe, right? Because after World War II, when the Cold War began, there was like a very concentrated effort by Western leaders to portray the Soviet Union as the real imperialists, right? So when there was like this whole post-colonial wave happening around the world, and all these nations were liberating themselves from Western European colonial powers, they would just try to portray the Soviet Union as the real colonial power in the world, and portray socialism as a colonizing force. And I don't remember which prime minister it was, but I think it was I don't remember which British prime minister it was, but he would like refer to the Soviet Union as the that's the real colonizing power in the world right now. And I think when you look at the Cold War era and like the competition that the Soviets were forced into getting into with the Western powers, you can see that even if their attempts at like trying to in some sort of way to help these anti-colonial struggles and militarily, or to give aid to these people, are always very minimal, like compared to the Western countries, like even Scandinavian countries back in those days, in the 50s, in the 60s, were giving more aid, and I mean like I don't mean aid with development aid to these countries than the Soviet Union was giving. Like I think there was a study I read that would say that the Soviet Union collectively was giving less to all of its like all these countries, client states, if you would like to call them, was giving less to the states than the United States was giving to Israel at the time. So the Soviet, so this idea that the Soviet Union was just going around the world and acting in the same ways as the Western colonial powers were doing is wrong. But I also think that there is also always has to be nuance, and I think that the interactions between the Soviets and the so-called third world or the non-aligned movement, and I think their relationship with China and the Sino-Soviet split and everything else, I think there has to be nuance, and you can find a lot of nuance in the analysis that a lot of these historians do about this period. But that nuance is always lost anytime there is a need to mobilize the post-Soviet space against Russia and against, and just to serve these people's causes for imperialist and militarist purposes. And I think I'm going to bring this example because I feel like it's a good example of just showcasing just how deeply entrenched these narratives are. back when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, a lot of the civil society organizations in Armenia put out statements condemning the invasion, of course, and I think that's the right thing to do, obviously. But some of these organizations who had European aspirations and wanted to get Armenia into the European Union and force this, not force, but like lobby this government to adopt this agenda of European integration. They would also sort of put in some points about Armenia being part of NATO, Armenia being part of the EU, and all these organizations that always had very like principled anti-militarist stance would sign their names under this. And when I questioned them about this, they would say, "Oh, but that, like, globally speaking, that's not the important part. But the important part is the other, the condemnation of the invasion." But that's just not how it works. And I think that's also important to remember, just like how these geopolitical games that the states play are important. I think how some nationalisms are created more equal than other nationalisms, right? If your nationalism or ethno-nationalism even, can be instrumentalized against Russia or like the collective East, or like, for decolonization purposes, or like not even decolonization, just like can be instrumentalized against these countries, then it's okay. It's a good nationalism. But if your nationalism is, let's say, Armenian, and it's mostly against Turkey or Azerbaijan, or like is sort of a product of the first Nagorno-Karabakh war and also the whole Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, then you need to get rid of that nationalism. That's not a nationalism we accept. And I as someone who always like goes to these conferences and is very critical about Armenian nationalism, and all my research is always about like condemning Armenian nationalism, Armenian right-wingers, and like things that have, I historically consider to be bad, things done by Armenian leaders and the Armenian army. I'm always like, people always like praise me for this, for my scholarship, and tell me, oh, how great it is. And then comes somebody else from a post-Soviet state, let's say Ukrainian or Georgian, and their whole presentation is this like very mediocre, surface level, I'm sorry for saying this, but like mediocre, surface level, rarely properly cited research, where they just constantly create this mythology about their nation state, and it's very ethno-nationalist, and no one dares to question them on this, because we have to respect, as Volodymyr Ishchenko, this Ukrainian sociologist, says, Ukrainian voices. And like, and then he asks, like, which Ukrainian voices? Like, you never respect voices that are critical of Western powers, that are critical of NATO, that are critical of the EU. So which which Ukrainian voices, right? So I think it's important in this case also to see how decolonization is a very sinister tool in the hands of colonizers. And it's a very co-opted term that we need to reclaim, instead of like just saying, oh, this whole thing is just, mindless identity politics. We don't need this, or we can just forget about this. No, I think it's a concept that is very, very useful. It just needs to be reclaimed from those who are trying to derail any conversation that comes back to them, comes back to, I don't know, British imperialism or American imperialism, or even like German imperialism.
So if I could actually ask something more, I don't know why I've taken on like an interviewer role today, but it's just questions are also part of the process, yeah, because I keep having questions coming up. So it seems that we've established that the sort of what decolonization has meant historically, or like in the, how can I say, like in the sense that when in the original sense of it, like from the actual action of throwing your colonizer off your back, as Tamat was saying. So it's clear that this has been the term has been kind of co-opted and now means something else in some contexts. And I'm curious, like, and we also try to understand like why it has started to mean this other thing, right? I'm curious in the Armenian context in that case, like why, like, I'm curious, like, what is the purpose? Like, what is this co-opted definition of decolonization doing in Armenia? Like, what is it? What is it doing here? Why are people in civil society applying it to the Armenian context in the way that they're applying it, with the like co-opted definition of this term? What do you think?
I think it's mostly a result of the Armenian civil society being so dependent on research grants coming from the West, Western institutions, Western states. And, I firmly believe that your research agendas are born out of your own academic and scholarly curiosity. So you just go around the world and you're like, why is it this way? And then you start to think about it, read about it, and discuss with other people, and then come to some sort of enlightenment, right? But these research agendas, that come with grants, they are already set very firmly. So a certain embassy in Yerevan says, I have this much money. You have to do this specific research with this specific methodology. For example, you have to conduct interviews, expert interviews, or do focus group, or this or that. I don't know. So both the methodology and the research agenda are already set. So you have everything. Your job is just to go in there and then follow the instructions and be a good little researcher and do your job, and then do grant report in the end of the day. So there is no autonomy in the knowledge production economy in Armenia and in a whole post-Soviet space. So what you have is just this. I read this in an article yesterday. You have self-colonization as a career strategy. You go into this colonial powers, and then you ask them for research grants, and then you sometimes object to the things that they tell you, but mostly you do as you are told, and you produce knowledge for their own geopolitical interests. And I think whenever Europe has a vested interest in promoting certain narratives, you will see all these research projects happening in Armenia that are completely irrelevant to the everyday lives of Armenians, and are just research projects that the professional middle classes take on. Not everyone has access to these projects and these spaces and these networks. And the professional middle classes are the people who are the want-mores and not the have-nots. So their research is always about it's very liberal. It's very respectful in the language that they do. Like, this respectability politics plays a very important role. I've been to spaces where I've been asked to talk about decolonization. I've been asked to, people praised me for my insights and views. But then again, I also, in those same spaces, I've also been asked to not be too critical and to tone it down a little bit with all my, Marxist, feminist, radical criticisms. And I think that happens whether it is inside NGOs here in Armenia, whether it is in more global scale, research initiatives everywhere. They want you to do research on decolonization. They want you to hold them accountable and all that, very vague and I don't know how to say in Armenian. We say the Hozvats language, that there is to obscure the facts of the matter. I think in Armenia, mostly when people want you to talk about decolonization, they want you to talk about Russia. And whenever you bring up all these other countries, they're like, oh, that doesn't like necessarily have anything to do with the context that we are describing today. But to me, if you understand decolonization as a process that is deeply anti-capitalist, you can never, methodologically speaking, you can never stop at Russia. You have to understand the global political economy and how that same Russia is very much, a capitalist periphery, and how it is sustained by the financial institutions that exist in the West, and that and that same Russia is a product. Today's Russia, the post-Soviet Russia, is a product of Western free marketization and all these reforms that have been done. And I think Tamar was saying, like, they try to see a continuity between the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and today's Russia, as if like the Soviet Union wasn't like a huge rupture and a break in that. They try to have like a very straight line from the czars to today's Putin. And I think, methodologically speaking, that just doesn't work. Because in the end of the day, you have to consider questions of economy. You have to, it's not just, like Tamar says, it's not just about the cultural imperialism aspect, because imperialism is a process that is very much economic. And we have to understand, like, where does today's Russia get its capital, and how is that capital sustained and, in the global economy? Because economically speaking, Russia isn't the greatest economy in the world. I think it is smaller than most European states, its economy. So we have to sort of, but in Armenia, if you try to be more nuanced, I think that's both academia and NGOs are very, I don't know, how to say, hostile to anyone that is critical of these narratives. And I have had people like would say, like, we talk to each other, and if you say something that's inappropriate to us, someone else will know, and you will become someone who is unhireable. Like you would not find a job, you would not have access to a lot of these projects, you would become someone who is very hard to work with. I also think that is why there is not much of a very public discourse in Armenia happening right now against this research projects and against these grants and against everything, NGOs just in general, because people care for their own careers, care about the next grants that these NGOs are going to give out.
Who's going to have these conversations? I mean, it's like people don't know what's happening. It's like its own little world that no one really knows what's happening. It's just sort of happening there. But I just want to say something about, like, sort of how I see, like, what this term in the co-opted way that it is doing in Armenia, to me, is in a way sort of like the word denial comes to me, like sort of like helping people deny their own reality in a way that they are in, and be in a kind of delusional understanding of it. And it's actually I think it's a very violent thing to do to people, like, because it's like a very, like, psychological thing, actually, like, for you to think that you can return to Europe, if that's what this term is doing in Armenia, that you can be all the things that basically, it's almost, to me, it almost feels like like the way that it's being used is like decolonization means that you can be, like, it's like this narrative of the strong and the weak. So you can be the strong, you can be on the side of the strong, and you can be the colonizer almost, in a way, which is ridiculous, because that's never going to be possible for people here. So it's like denying your own reality and making you delusional to think that you can be something that you can never be. That's one. And in that process, I think the other thing that it's doing is denying the connection or the solidarity with actual like colonized peoples, in the region. In a way, maybe it's also denying us a connection with our neighbors, especially to the south. I'm thinking about Iran, honestly, and like, and beyond, so to kind of make people think that they belong to something that is not an other, when it's not actually the case. Like, so I don't know. This is what I was thinking. Tamar, do you have on this?
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to quickly say that all that talk about in a way that it's always about like the culture is very deliberate, right? Because it's a way not to talk about class, not to talk about class interests, and I think especially people here in academia, in the NGOs, have like a vested interest in not talking about their class interests whenever they produce research. And that also helps them, hide the fact that they're not doing this research for pure curiosity, but just for money. And I think...
Yeah, there's a couple of like things that I thought of when you were both speaking, and one of them is like the way in which, again, alongside this question of culture, is like when NGOs are or NGO actors in Armenia are talking about colonialism now, it seems it's mostly a focus on a form rather than a content, right? Like where it's like whatever form things take, when they look similar, they must be the same thing. Or if we can make things look like they're similar, then we can say, well, that and that are the same thing as colonialism, right? And like thinking about like conversations that I've had with various people about like how both the colonial empires, like let's say the British Empire and the Soviet colonial empire were both very destructive of of the environment, and thus they're the same thing, right? But it's like modernity is destructive of the environment, period. It can be colonial, it can be we can say in fact, I'll concede the point, right, that destruction of the environment is a colonial relation to nature. That is a fact, right? That I'll concede. But to compare one in terms of its content to another in terms of its content is absolutely ludicrous to me, right? Because we all destroy the environment in modernity. We all destroy the environment with different intentions. Some of it is racist and genocidal and completely extractive, and some of it is toward creating, toward producing things that are, supposed to, be used for use value, let's say, right? And that whole idea that the Soviet development was very destructive to the environment. Yes, it was. Was it as destructive as, the entire the colonization of the entire planet and completely ruining and sacrificing entire regions of the earth, that is still continuing to do that for the same capital interest, for the same political entities as is happening today? I don't think those are the same thing, right? Like creating cities that get in the way of rivers running, bad, right? It's bad. Generally, when you get in the way of nature, you're going to suffer eventually because nature will always win. But is it as bad as like creating, of creating entire countries that are trash depositories for, you know, that you have over there. You put all of your garbage over there, and then you don't have to deal with it, and so you look like a wonderful clean country where you respect your citizens and all of this, right? So we compare like about how the Soviet Union would pollute lakes and rivers and all of these things within its own boundaries. We have to remember that it was doing it within its own boundaries, that it was doing it in the same areas and the regions where it was also allocating and distributing products that it was producing out of that destruction of the environment. Because modernity is fucked up. Modernity is destructive. It just is, right? Industrialization is destructive. But the content, the form is industrialization. The content is an entirely different kind of thing. While colonialism is destroying someone else's land, someone else's population, you know, making life impossible elsewhere so that within its own territory it can live okay and look nice. The Soviet Union didn't do that, right? Because in fact it did not colonize, because in fact it destroyed, but it also allocated, and it also, you know, it didn't go elsewhere to take someone else. That I think is like the key point about form. Also in terms of like form and content, right? Linguistically, in terms of language, like I hear this from my own students all the time, right? Wasn't there a Russification of all of the Soviet republics? Like, didn't they force them all to speak? First of all, no, that's not true. Actually, that's not what happened. And in fact, there was a concerted effort for indigenization in the Soviet Union, a concerted effort for each republic to actually conduct business in their own language. And this was also part of the national policy of the Soviet Union, to try to create nations who work as nations in order for the Soviet Union to be a conglomeration of nations, right? But also, is that what colonialism is? Forcing someone to speak your language? Because I mean, can we say the same thing about like how the entire NGO infrastructure of the entire post-Soviet world operates right now, right? Like you have an entire class of people who speak English. And, you know, as far as, you know, I've been told, not only do they speak English professionally with the donor organizations in Europe and the United States and elsewhere, they speak English to one another in their own country, right? That is, as far as, you know, that is actually not how business was conducted in the Soviet era, right? Yeah.
I'm
I
aware
think
of, yeah, go ahead. I just want to make sure we get to our last question.
I just wanted to continue on the issue of like the industrialization and then deindustrialization. So when you study like the effects of deindustrialization in the post-Soviet space, I always like ask myself this question. So if it was like a really like this imperialist colonization of this like other peripheries, right? And I don't deny that like the hegemonic relationship existed between Moscow and the different republics. I definitely like I think that there is nuance there. But if you study the industrialization of the post-Soviet space, you will see just how similar the experiences of workers are when the factory closes, like when the factory is no longer there. I was stunted, like I was literally like crying reading all this different research and like that people did with in the North Caucasus, in different parts of Russia, in Armenia, or like other places in the post-Soviet space, where people talk about like what happened after the factory no longer was operating, and those experiences are also similar to that of the post-Yugoslav states. And that to me, I was participating in a conference last year about like the industrialization, and a scholar from Slovenia was talking about how there is a lot of grief that people carry, the industrialized workers, and her study was with textile workers who are mainly women, and how like them losing the factory, the place that they took care of, their machinery, their tools that they took care of, that carried a lot of grief, but they weren't allowed to grieve publicly. And then I realized that's the same thing also like sort of happened in Armenia. You weren't allowed to publicly say, oh, I miss, this and that, because you would be accused of being, a Russian stooge, and you would be accused of being someone who wanted to be, part of the Russian Empire, not the, and you're not a very independent-minded person. And I think that also helped a lot in like sort of hiding and marginalizing any discussions of class and how working class in this country has transformed in the past 30 years. Like I think it's very important to also see like how like those experiences are very sometimes universal in the post-Soviet space and also in the post-socialist space just in general.
So I think one of the other things that we've established is that there is a difference between the post-Soviet and the post-colonial, and it should not be conflated with one another, despite like there being some similarities in terms of just the but I do think that one of the like I always see the Soviet collapse as like the West, or this, like the West, basically capitalism winning this war, this Cold War against this more socialist world. And then because usually like the way that it works, right, or that we're told is that when you win, then you go and you take over, right? And so that's like a normal, that's kind of what happened actually, right? So the Iron Curtain fell, and then you can go in and just kind of everything is a free space to sort of experiment in, to like bring to open up more markets. And so in a way, decolonization can be relevant for Armenia because even though if we think about colonization historically means a very specific thing, I think that, and then when you had all of these like anti-colonial movements that threw this colonizers off their backs, there's still a legacy that this Western powers, through their capitalism, through their freedom and human rights and democracy, are trying to sort of like impose on most of the world, right, as the way that, as the things that we should see as norms. And like this dominance of the Western way, to me, is a kind of neo-colonial way of relating to the others, or so it can be relevant for Armenia. So the question is, how can we actually think seriously about decolonization in Armenia? And what would that mean, and what would that look like?
I think because like the first thing that comes to my mind is always like development actors and like different institutions, whether it is the World Bank, whether it is the IMF, or our local NGOs. I think it's important to remember that these institutions produce knowledge for specific geopolitical interests. Always, those interests are never independent of the knowledge that they produce. And even if there's sometimes people in there who are outliers and try to do research that is innovative or like outside of things, those people do quickly get disciplined, and a certain order is quickly established in order to signal to the others that this is unacceptable behavior, this is unacceptable to do. Like, and I think In Armenia, when we talk about decolonization in the Armenian context, it's always important to remember the neoliberalization of Armenia and like the relationship the Armenian markets have to the outside financial institutions and the different, the global political economy, and how this discourse is always like in Armenia these days that we have that peace will come to Armenia through neoliberalization of Armenia's infrastructure, right? So if we neoliberalize our railways, our lands, our resources, whether it is natural or otherwise, then we will be a peaceful, prosperous, and developed country. There is always this narrative that neoliberalization always will equal to development. And I think especially in the past like 2 or 3 years, maybe our government has been pushing this narrative very, very actively. And it's very sad that I don't see many prominent public intellectuals criticizing this, going against this, because to me, I do consider, like, there are people who say, oh, it's been 30 years since the Soviet Union fell. So there's not really a generation in Armenia that is very, that had lived experiences of the post-Soviet of the Soviet years. So you can't really say this, and then you can't really say that this, and then you can't really say that the Armenian government saying this is unnatural. But I do still believe that to a lot of people's ears, what they hear from the government is unnatural. To my mom, I always talk about my mom during this podcast. To my mom, to my dad, to people who are working class, who felt politically abandoned by the ruling elites in Armenia, whether it is the Pashinyan government or the governments before them, whether it was Robert Kocharian or Levon Ter-Petrosyan or Serge Sargsyan. That political abandonment is very continuous. And now, before it was the oligarchs with their narratives about development, militarism, nationalism, or whatever. And now we have these neoliberal corporatists who are always siding with the corporate powers. What we saw earlier this year at the Zangezur Combine, we saw that the Armenian government was into some really shady business deals with this Russian oligarch, Roman Trotsenko. They used this guy's financing to push out the Armenian oligarchs that owned the mine, right? So nobody else was willing to do the dirty work. Maybe that's why they brought in the Russian money. And when the Russians came, things got increasingly worse at the mine. We saw how the workers were in February during their strikes were saying, we are treated as second-class citizens, as slaves. They come in here and, they talk to us in very colonial manner. So, and then the army, what did the Armenian government do during the whole 10 days? I think it was for 10 days the strike went on. And it was a very popular strike. And then, the workers did very innovative things during that strike. There was a public vote and everything. So the government sided with the corporate powers. It said, well, we're losing money the longer this strike goes on. And then, the unions in Armenia, the unions that are there, the professional class that is there to protect the workers, didn't do so until it was reminded by journalists at the scene that, they could take you to court for not siding with the workers. Do you understand this? And then the union head suddenly decided to shift her narrative and be pro-worker. But this is the same thing is also happening with Amur Saj. And we have seen how the UK and the US embassies in Armenia have been pushing the Armenian government ever since it came to power in 2018 to open up the mine, even if the local population and a lot of people in Armenia are against it, even if there has been a popular uprising against this. Once in a while, you will see the U.S. ambassador go to this mine and then look at it, and then there is all these narratives that if we give the mine to Western capital, then we will bring peace to these regions that are in direct contact with, are on the contact line of contact with Azerbaijan, right? So if there is like Western capital here, then it means that we are going to be protected. That's like Milena was saying, that's delusional thinking. Capital is not going to save you. It didn't work with the Russians. Certainly, let's give everything to Russia and then they will come and protect us. That didn't work, and it's not going to work with Western powers either. So you might as well just be more level-headed and rational about it. Like, instead of just giving out everything you own to this other, all sorts of capitalists, whether they're Russian or Swedish or I don't know, British. And then, recently this year, I was also studying a couple of. I was working for someone who was doing research about Armenian political economy, and we were studying the top 100 companies in Armenia. And we were trying to find the real owners of these companies. And most of these companies, you can't find the real owners. So it's sometimes a very complicated scheme to hide who the real owner is. And sometimes the real owner is an Armenian oligarch. But sometimes the Armenian oligarchs don't even shy away from claiming that this is them. There is like a different like a consortium of Armenian, Russian, and British companies coming together, and I think it's always fascinating to find out just how much. Like, people say, oh, but they're geopolitically against each other. How come they could, cooperate? That's because they do business. That's how capitalism works. Like, if you understand, what capitalism, what the capitalist expansionism is, and like the idea of free markets and like the financial institutions that support it, of course, that's exactly what they're gonna do. Even if like they pretend the Russian sanctions and everything, Europe still uses Russian gas and oil, and even if it comes from Azerbaijan, even if it's like everyone wants like to pretend that that's not what's happening, but that's still the reality. So I think in Armenia, if you start with capitalism, understanding of how capitalism has changed and transformed people's lives in Armenia, the everyday people's lives in Armenia, then you will find your answers to decolonization. But if you're trying to do research that is just mostly about some obscure events that happened in the Soviet Union that are just mostly policy failures and failures on the parts of the Soviets back then to consider from engineering standpoint, from architectural standpoint, from culture, from like different standpoints to consider stuff, those are just failures. And I think they deserve to be criticized. But if you're just going to be doing that, then you're not going to find your answer. And I think that last thing I'm going to say is just like, if you're a scholar who is constantly invited into this colonial spaces, if you're a decolonial, someone considers to be themselves to be a decolonial scholar, and you're constantly invited into these colonial spaces to testify against this Soviet colonialism or whatever, if you testify in front of the U.S. Congress about Soviet colonialism, that you're not someone who deserves to be taken seriously as a decolonization scholar. That's all I'm going to say. Like, if you study decolonization, you have to have solidarity with colonized people everywhere. You're not my colonizer bad, your colonizer not my business. That's not how it works. You have to have a consistent line, and you have to have a principled line in your understanding and your methodology. And you're not going to be doing this if you still want to enjoy a very comfortable middle-class professional life. I don't think you should be doing decolonization research. I don't think that's for you.
Tamar, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, I want to say a few things that was That was a really comprehensive answer. And I think on the question of capital, absolutely right, that ultimately the era of colonialism that we are living in globally in Armenia, in everywhere, is capital. Capital is the main colonizing force, right? And capital, of course, is not free of states and of sovereignty. Capital is grounded under particular flags. But capital also betrays those flags all the time, right? And the ways in which you laid it out, Sona, were yeah, absolutely right on point. But one of the other ways in which we really should be thinking about colonization and decolonization in Armenia, I think, is in the way in which, and we've touched on this in different ways, but the way in which the Europe and the US have been pouring money into Armenia for decades now. And so, like, I remember, years ago when I would hear these, like, narratives. I won't name people now. They're all kind of big names in Armenian, culture and the supposed, like, left or the progressives, but would talk about, like, how can we get, more like Europe, right? In Europe they have this, in Europe they have that kind of freedom. In Europe, I remember hearing an interview with somebody, a literary critic, who's like, in Europe you could walk around in the streets wearing whatever you want and no one will say anything to you, right? When are we going to get freedom in this country, and why can't we? And this idea that, like, Europe is this wonderful safe haven that's, and we need to move there. This is, again, the return to Europe narrative that was building for a while. This is all a result of a concerted, like, funding, right? It's been funded to change the minds and the subjectivities of Armenia. I heard this term recently by it was used actually by Artur Khachikian, who's a international relations political scientist in Armenia, who's talking about informational annexation, which I thought was such a wonderful term, right? Informational annexation. You produce, you spend all this money, you create the information, you produce certain subjects, right, that are going to be amenable to free market ideologies, to liberalization, to other things too, human rights, women's rights, gay rights, but in a particular guise where it's all about individual freedoms and whatever, and discrimination, not about actual structural changes that would come with not just political and civil rights but also economic rights. None of that is, of course, going to be accounted for because it's liberalism, after all. And
But I think the whole point of those things is to put in place structures that will be, like, destructive of those, like, relations and ways of life.
Those ways of life that, especially in the post-Soviet world, really existed, right? When Sona is, like, talking about, like, when you're talking about, like, your mother who sees these things and is, like, shocked and it seems unnatural to her, because the Soviet subject was a particular kind of subject. The socialist subject was, and I'm not saying, like, what a wonderful subject that was and we should, but it was a particular kind of subject that saw the world in a particular way, had certain expectations of states and power, and understood rights in particular ways, economic rights being a major one of those, right? And now you have, like, people who think, well, I'm a gay, so my rights are, gay rights, and you're Yazidi, and so that's your issue, that's your problem, you go worry about that, I'll worry about what's, like, where's the struggle, right? Decolonization, right, is, if we're going to talk about decolonization, it's about bringing together all of the ways in which oppression occurs, because it's a systemic way in which all of those things operate together. These issues are this issue and that issue and whatever. And of course, these are all sites of economic competition with one another, because each of them is applying for a grant from the fucking EU or, the National Endowment for Democracy or whatever it might be, all, to get a grant here and a grant there. And they're literally killing each other over these grants, right? They're stepping on each other. And so in any case, Armenians have actually been molded into particular kinds of subjects who can now, actually watch Armenia lease its territory out for 99 years to a foreign power to occupy it on the border of a country with whom Armenia has had good relations with, and which that occupying power has terrible relations with. A much bigger economy, a much more developed economy, right, than Armenia is, which a much stronger military power in the region, right? I mean, this is mind blowing, right? That Armenians can actually see this. Of course, many Armenians are against this, especially in the South. We know that many Armenians are against this, so-called Trump corridor. But it's also that many Armenians are not. And of course, the NGO professional class is looking at this and thinking, this is great. It's going to bring peace and, all of this kind of stuff. The absurdity of thinking that the destruction between Armenia and Iran's border relation is somehow going to turn out good for Armenia, right? Not to mention the destructive relation that this is going to produce between Armenia and Russia. Armenia's number one economic partner is still Russia, no matter what, the Pashinyan regime wants to imagine about that, right? To think that there are people right now in Armenia who think that this is great.
But I think that way of thinking is being colonized.
Yes, that is yeah, absolutely. And that is a form. I mean, this is soft power, right? This is what we used to call soft power and whatever. But
manufacturing consent.
Consent, and the level at which, right? Like it's, when you see this in kind of slow and fast motion, right? I've seen it happening over the years, and slowly, but then it came to this toward the last like few years. It's been like speeding up at a rate that I haven't even really like been able to follow. And of course that has everything to do with the so-called revolution, and it's quite shocking. And the fact that it's at this very moment that civil society is now talking about colonialism and whatever, and the only colonialism is Russia, right? It's and not even Russian capital. The only colonialism is Russian, Russians are bad. And colonialism, somehow Armenia is being colonized because of Russia invaded Ukraine. Somehow Armenia is colonized now because the Soviet Union was bad and evil, right? There's no content to those discussions. There's no content, and it is dangerous. It is dangerous right now. Those are my last words.
I don't know if we want to end on that. It's really depressing. Yeah.
But there's possibility. I think there is possibility. And the professional, the newly made NGO middle class, I don't think is a site of hope for Armenia. But alongside all of this, it is also becoming clear that many people in Armenia are waking up. It's not the activists, right? But there are people who are seeing all of this, and waking up to it. And the recent the Zangezur strike is one of those sites where we see that kind of coming alive. And also the Al-Musad protests, the occupation of the entrance to the Al-Musad mine was also that moment of hope. And that's there. We just have to look for it outside of the class that claims decolonization as its purpose.
Maybe that's a good place to end. So thank you, Sona, for being here with us, for being our guest. I think this was a very interesting conversation. Hopefully the people who are listening to us also found it interesting. If you have any ideas, any thoughts, any questions or comments on any of the issues that we brought up in today's episode, please leave us a comment, engage with us, and as always, subscribe, like, and yeah, and we'll see you in another 2 weeks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sona. This was a really great conversation. And Thank you for joining us. Hopefully we'll have you on again soon. And thank you, listeners. Subscribe, share, comment, like.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.